it on our YouTube channel, and I'll send a link out to the recording of this. I think tomorrow I'll be able to process the video and get it up there for y'all.
Get it up there.
But if you don't mind muting yourselves to improve the quality of the recording, that'd be greatly appreciated. And of course, we'll be unmuting throughout to ask questions and whatnot.
Don't worry, I won't ask questions.
Robert.
Hello,
right.
Pam.
Can you mute everybody, or because I'm having a problem trying to mute him.
Yeah, I can mute him.
She has no trouble muting me. Don't believe her.
Yeah, we can mute anybody we want. I
Thank
can
you.
like mute Mark. Yeah, Lawrence, I can mute Mark.
Hey, don't mute me now. All right, let's get this show on the road. I'm gonna be I'm gonna talk at you a little bit and then set the scene and let Pam take over. But hello and thank you for your interest in tonight's topic, New Hampshire's winter birds with Dr. Pamela Hunt.
Thank you.
My name is Mark Nutter. I'm the grants manager here at New Hampshire Audubon, and tonight I'll be your webinar czar. I work with Pam in proposing new and exciting avian research projects to local, state, and federal funders. And this evening, we continue our bi-monthly science speaker series featuring New Hampshire Audubon staff. We're going to have a great time this evening, and I'm glad each and every one of you could be here. And to try to make this event as in-person as behind a screen can be, please consider leaving your video on during the presentation, and importantly, during the Q&A session afterwards. We'd love to see your face. Like I said, I'll be recording this presentation to share with just the folks who have registered. But before we get too far down the road, I would just like to mention a new relationship that New Hampshire Audubon has begun with Paul and Denise Julio and others at the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective. And it's our shared goal to bring Indigenous history to light here in New Hampshire to more fully understand the places that we cherish the most. We've only had a few meetings so far with the group, but we're excited to continue learning more as we develop interpretive signage, highlighting Abenaki names of fauna and flora, in addition to sharing Indigenous place-specific history at our centers and wildlife sanctuaries. And I'd like to recognize that developing relationship with the following land acknowledgement. This presentation takes place in Pennacook, New Hampshire, which is located within the site of the ancient village of Pennacook in Nadakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Alnombak, who have stewarded Nadakina throughout the generations and for thousands of years. If you'd like to learn more about the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective, just go to their website, www.newindigenousnh.com. I would also like to take this opportunity to briefly describe how this webinar fits into the larger mission at New Hampshire Audubon. For those of you who don't know, New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that's completely independent from National Audubon. We rely on members and donors like you to support our charitable mission, which has 4 pillars. Connecting people to nature through environmental education experiences like school programs and this webinar, researching and conserving species.
Yeah, your slide's a little funky looking.
I can't even see that. Well, in any
like
case,
the lower left-hand corner of it.
We'll edit this part out. Don't worry. All right. In any case, we do environmental education. We do species-based conservation research. We conserve and manage 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state, and we advocate for sound environmental policy in the New Hampshire State Legislature. And I'm here today because of donors and members like you. We also have a huge network of over 2,000 volunteers that assist us with wildlife monitoring, ambassador animal care, environmental education, and wildlife sanctuary management throughout the state. If you are a member, supporter, or volunteer, I'd like to thank you. If you'd like to become a member, volunteer, or supporter, please check out our newly designed website that I hope connects you better to the great work that we're doing throughout the state. I think everyone is pretty comfortable with Zoom. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question at any time, or put it in the chat, and we'll stop throughout the presentation to answer those questions.
Do they have to ask to unmute, Mark?
I think they can just unmute.
Okay.
You can try right now, and if you can unmute, yeah, Holly, you did it. Thank you. You can just unmute
Okay.
when you need to have a question. And now,
Question?
yeah, you have a question?
Keep an eye
Last
on that guy.
thing, I want to introduce Pam. Pam Hunt has been interested in birds since the tender age of 12, when an uncle took her to Brigadine National Wildlife Refuge in New Jersey. She went on to earn a bachelor's in biology from Cornell, a master's in zoology from University of Montana, and a PhD from Dartmouth College in 1995. Pam came to New Hampshire Audubon in the year 2000 after 5 years as an adjunct faculty at Colby Sawyer College in New London. In her current position as an avian conservation biologist, she works closely with the New Hampshire Fish and Game to coordinate and prioritize bird research and monitoring in the state, and has also authored New Hampshire's State of the Birds report. Specific areas of interest also include habitat use by early successional birds, particularly whippoorwills, conservation of aerial insectivores like swifts and swallows, and the effects of events outside the breeding season has on long-distance migrants. Pam also coordinated the New Hampshire Dragonfly Survey, a 5-year project that mapped distributions of these insects throughout the state, and remains active in the dragonfly field. And with that, here's Pam.
Ta-da! Hi, everybody. Yes, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Jim. Whoever else is clapping, be like, yeah, Mark. Okay. Thank you. I haven't even talked yet. All right. So this will be fun. As Mark said, I will be able to take questions a few times. Try not to ask too many questions, otherwise we just don't get very far. We'll try to have a couple of breaks, perhaps partway through, and certainly time at the end to ask lots of questions, and people can show us their cats, like Jim, whose cat I've met. It's a very wonderful cat. And we'll go from there, but keep it inside. All right, let's see. I might take this going. Let's see. Aha, is that working for folks?
It is now.
You see the nice picture of Robin there? And you can also type questions into the chat. Mark and I will both glance at it now and then in case there's like a question like, Pam, you're talking too fast, or things like that, because I can sometimes talk really, really fast about them. So anyway, yes, this talk is about birds in winter in New Hampshire, appropriately enough, in the middle of January. And it's mostly about population trends of these birds, because that's one of the things I do a lot of work with in my job, is looking at population trends and evaluating species for conservation priorities and whatnot. So we're going to talk about mostly population trends, but use those as a springboard for all sorts of other things we can talk about fun biology of the birds we have in New Hampshire in the winter and what's kind of going on with them. And it starts and ends with opportunities and announcements about how actually you guys can help, anybody can help collect the data that most of this talk is based on. So we'll start with that. And you'll see this link again and again. Maybe we could even put it in the chat so people could cut and paste it. The Backyard Winter Bird Series, which started in 1967, when Audubon decided, along with Massachusetts, to start monitoring the expanding populations of titmice, mockingbirds, and cardinals in the state. If you go back to 1967, when I was just a wee lass, there were not very many mockingbird, titmice, and cardinals in New Hampshire at all. They had just started showing up in the state. And this was part of an effort in New England to just slowly get a better feel for how rapidly those species were expanding. And we'll talk about them obviously when we get to those species. 20 years later, that survey was expanded to include all species. And so now people count everything from eagles to ducks, whatever's in their yards on the weekend that the count is held. It's always held the second weekend in February. This year, that is the 13th and 14th. And we'll talk a bit more about that at the end again if people are interested and have questions and so forth. So that's the source of most of the data here. Another data source that I might refer to now and then is the Christmas bird count. And that's another long-term program that National Audubon runs. Been going on since around 1900. There are 18 counts that are entirely in New Hampshire and another few on the border. And those are done within a weekend or so of Christmas every year. And again, collecting lots of data that help us look at populations of birds during the non-breeding season. Okay, so everybody knows what this bird is, right? Hopefully. Is this a good time for one of those quizzes, Mark?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can do a quiz.
I can't remember what the first quiz was. We've got a bunch of poll questions that we threw in here for people to answer. So this is a cardinal. And as I mentioned, this was one of these species that we first started with. And yeah, now there's a little poll up here. Everybody can just click on one of those answers really quickly. We'll sort of see what your answers are relative to what the data show. And we'll get to that in a second. Look at that, the votes are coming in. It's just like, Georgia last week and everything. And I'll be curious. Okay, so far nobody's not seen them.
Well, that's good.
We got to make sure every vote is counted. Or if not, then we won't bother. What's that? Oh, 6 more to vote.
Pretty
Oh,
close.
let's keep going. Oh. Oh.
Okay.
Somebody, one poor soul. I bet that's Ann and David's friends in Raymond that hasn't seen it. We could just end it probably at this
Yeah,
point.
well, I'm gonna call it. It's about a minute, and those are the answers.
The official data there show that close to half of you said they have about the same. 8 out of 21 said they're more abundant. 2 said less abundant, and 1 doesn't see them. So let's go to the bird and we'll go to the actual data, which is, whoa, the poll came back up. Go away. Here's the data going back to 1967 for cardinals in New Hampshire. As I mentioned, they are one of these increasing species. They were almost non-existent here in the early 60s and have just been going up by gangbusters since, pretty consistently. If you divide those numbers by the number of observers, it's not quite as steep a trend, but they are definitely increasing. Where they are not really going gangbusters still is Coos County, because that's north of the White Mountains, and they just haven't quite got there yet, although they're showing up now pretty regularly in Lancaster and Gorham and even occasionally in places like Jefferson. So they're getting there, and why the species is increasing has been a matter of much debate over the last several decades. A very obvious theory right now is that climate change has got something to do with this. They're a southern species. And, we haven't been talking about climate change since the 60s, but we've been talking about it a lot in the last 20 years. And the species has certainly potentially benefited from that. Increasing in bird feeders may have also been a benefit to the species. For whatever reason, it is definitely here to stay. It does quite well where people are, and it's increasing nicely. Same sort of story here. Okay, what is this? This guy, one of the other original cohort of birds. This is a tufted titmouse, and its pattern is essentially very similar to the cardinals. If anything, it's a little less common still north of the notches, but it's also starting to show up there. Probably for the same general reasons. Most of the birds we're going to be talking about during this talk are non-migratory. Obviously, they are birds that breed here and winter here. They're not migratory at all. There are a few that move south and show up here, or a few that move short distances. But these first 3 we're talking about are all resident species that almost take no annual movements whatsoever. and they just like hanging out feeders. Oh, there we go. So there's a nice contrast there. It might not show very well if you're on the bottom right of that graph, gets blocked by the participants, but you can see that the trend is, far fewer titmice in the northern half of the state than the southern half of the state, but still slowly increasing in both. This guy is the mockingbird. And mockingbirds show a very interesting trend because they go up and then they go down again.
Hmm.
And this pattern is actually shown in Christmas count data. It's also shown in another survey called the breeding bird survey, which happens in the summer all across the state and a bunch of different routes. So mockingbirds increased quite dramatically through the late 60s into the mid 80s, and then dropped and are still dropping. And we honestly have no idea why mockingbirds are dropping. They're still often quite common. So I can't really imagine how much more common they were, considering, look at those numbers. It's 20 birds, no, 200, excuse me, down to like, an average of 25 or so now. So they were basically an order of magnitude more common, 30 years ago than they are now. They're not declining everywhere, but some people wonder if it's got to do with changes to plant communities with invasive species and fruit. And, it's one of those questions. If somebody out there on this call, on this talk, wants to get a PhD late in life or something, or a master's, maybe there's a little project here that you could undertake. Look at mockingbird populations and food supply across northern New England. Piece of cake. Also, fairly early on, a couple of years later in the survey, they added mourning doves, because mourning doves were another species that were apparently increasing. And the data for mourning doves are a little less clear. These data go back to apparently here in 1981. By that point, they look like they'd already kind of stabilized, so they can see a little bit of an increase in the blue line at the bottom in the northern part of the states. They were probably still increasing there at that point. And these guys, unlike the other three, will undertake seasonal movements and be more or less common, and that's probably what that variation in the pink line is showing. Okay, so those were the original invaders. Nowadays, there's a whole other set of invaders, and this is a weird photo because it looks like these are actually the same photo, but there's two photos here. And this is a great time to ask if anybody knows what these two species are. Not so much like, have you seen them at your feeders, but these are less common species, although they're increasing dramatically. If anyone wants to sort of mention something in the chat or not, I'll just keep talking. But these two have only recently invaded the state. I remember the bird on the left is a red-bellied woodpecker. And when I first moved to New Hampshire in late 80s, this was a very rare bird. And yep, there we go, Nancy wins. And there was a pair that showed up in Hollis, just outside of Nashua. And people from all over New Hampshire drove to Hollis to see red-bellied woodpecker for the state, because they'd never seen one in New Hampshire before. So that was like 1992 or something like that. Now I can step on my door and find 2 or 3 within the 10-minute walk. And the same is even more so true for Carolina wrens, which were really rare back in the early 90s and are now all over the place, south of the Lakes region and occasionally farther north. And their data show that same pattern. You can see that they were still pretty rare through the mid to late 90s, and then slowly increased through the 2000s. And then red bellies really took off right around, the late 2010s, mid 2010s, and are now pretty well established all over the state. The wren is interesting because the wren is, again, both southern non-migratory species. The wren is not super cold tolerant like a chickadee or a titmouse or a cardinal is. And during really cold winters, such as what happened, presumably right in here, maybe again here, is that they die back. If they can't find reliable food and shelter during really cold weather, they will succumb to the elements. And then it takes a few years for the populations to rebound again, whereas the woodpeckers are much tougher in that regard. So the wrens are slowly increasing, but a little more slowly because they're not as tolerant of the cold. So new species are constantly moving north into the state from farther south. The next one that's going to be invading is going to be fish crow, which is breeding all over the southern half of the state, but doesn't winter anywhere except maybe Salem and Nashua at this point. But eventually they'll be making it up into the state farther. A few other, now I'm just going to go through a bunch of common feeder birds, talk about what their populations are doing. Maybe this is a good time to take a quick break because I talked about the southern expanding species. If anybody has any specific questions about those and some of the patterns we're seeing there, because we're going to shift to a bunch of sort of very different topics. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. And if not, we'll just plod onward. And it doesn't look like anything. So it's all been explained perfectly, which is awesome. So this is a blue jay. We all know these guys. And, you know, this is a species we get calls about at Audubon about, well, you know, a couple of years ago, it's like, where's all the blue jays gone? Well, here's what they went. This is the data. And in fact, 2 winters ago, so the 2019 back November survey was the lowest number of blue jays ever. This graph is per person, per feeder. So it's really, you know, an average of 3 to 5 for forever. And then all of a sudden, boom, down to 1. And this is another common pattern we see in winter birds, in that winter birds that aren't permanent residents, like the chickadees, well, chickadees don't do that, cardinals, titmice in particular, red-bellied woodpeckers, will move around in response to food supplies. And the big food supply that blue jays rely on, especially in the winter and fall, is acorns. And acorns is roughly every other year where there's a big acorn crop. So in the fall of 2018, there was a very poor acorn crop. So all the blue jays that we normally would have had left. There were big flocks. If you were watching, they moved farther south somewhere to find where they could find food. And as a result, in the 2019 February count, we had record low numbers of blue jays. And then we had tons of acorns fall before last, and they were back up. And we had a ton of acorns again this year, and they're probably going to stay back in that normal range unless we have another big acorn failure. And that pattern of tracking food supplies is going to pop up again when we talk about finches, which will be very fun because there's a good finch stuff going on right now. A couple more of our regular feeder birds here. This is a tricky photo because they're not to scale. But this is the downy woodpecker on the left with the relatively small bill, and the hairy woodpecker on the right with the relatively large bill. Both are quite common feeder birds. They don't migrate at all. And the good news for these guys is that they're doing fine, if not slightly increasing. What's really interesting about the woodpeckers is that these two graphs are almost like exact mirrors of each other, right? Not mirrors, parallel to each other. There's a down that goes down. Why this is, I'm not sure. This is actually adjusted for observers, so it's not based on the number of people watching. For some reason, small environmental variables that might be affecting them are affecting them similarly. We might be expecting to see more increases in some of these woodpeckers because of emerald ash borer, that invasive beetle that is eating ash trees. As those trees die, they become very popular woodpecker foraging places, so that might also be helping woodpecker populations in the near future. Everybody's favorite little feeder bird is the black-capped chickadee, and black-capped chickadees are, like the blue jays, will occasionally migrate in small distances during the winter. They'll just like local shifts. You can see on the data from chickadees that there's this initial kind of decline, and then they've been pretty stable since around 2000. Some of this could be due to, you know, observer patterns. You know, no other data that I'm aware of shows any worries about chickadee declines. They just go up and down a little bit, again, with food supplies. And if there's lots, you know, a couple of years ago, there was tons and tons of calls. It might have actually been this low point here in 2018. People calling Audubon, where's all the chickadees gone? And the answer was they were just out in the woods finding food. Because if there's lots of food in the woods, they will quite happily eat it. And, you know, a common question we might get, I'll just answer it now, is that birds do not end up being reliant on bird feeders. You know, maybe Carolina wrens do a little bit, but all these other birds, if you had gone on vacation for 2 weeks, which you shouldn't do right now, there's a pandemic, the birds will find food. You know, you know, you do not need to worry about them being dependent upon your feeders. You know, they spend significant amount of time wandering around getting food in nature because they've been doing that for millions of years. And we're doing just great. A couple other frequent feeder visitors are our two nuthatches, the white-breasted on the left and the red-breasted on the right. If you look at their patterns, white-breasted is, I don't even put, white-breasted isn't very interesting, so I didn't put it out there. This is red-breasted nuthatch's graph, and they will occasionally have big invasions, like happened, looks like in 1994. I predict, and you can call me on this sometime in, you know, a year from now, that this next year is going to be another mega year for red-breasted nuthatches. They showed up in summer, and they're still here south of the notches in almost unprecedented numbers. And when they come to feeders, which they're actually still eating a lot of time in the woods, but eventually they'll show up at your feeders. I will expect them to be much more common because they moved south because, again, like the blue jays left here a few years ago, they left Canada because of lower food supplies. They're a species that we actually call an eruptive species, meaning they show these really irregular southward incursions when food supplies are lower in their main breeding range. And these guys nest all throughout New Hampshire and pine forest, but they get more common in winter when some move in from farther north. So expect a big spike in these guys on this year's count. Otherwise, I'll be in trouble because I predicted it. A few of our other common winter birds. This is a junco, like the nuthatch. Juncos do breed in New Hampshire in the western and northern parts of the state. But for most of us in the lowlands, they are not a common summer bird, but they're a very common winter bird. And like lots of other winter birds, they go up and down. You can see near the end here, a couple of really huge ups and downs with juncos, again, because of the availability of food at one point or another. I actually did an analysis a few years ago looking at Christmas count data from all up and down the East Coast. And the years that we had high junco numbers on the Christmas counts, which correspond pretty nicely to these peaks here, they also had lower numbers of juncos in the mid-Atlantic states because they just didn't go as far. They went only as far as they need to go to get their yummy winter food, because then they have to fly as far to get back to the nesting areas in the following spring. So they were kind of opportunistic migrants in that regard. They'll only go as far south as they need to go to find food. This is a species, the American tree sparrow, that does not breed in New Hampshire at all. It breeds in the Arctic tundra from Alaska through Canada and comes down here, you know, for the warm tropical climates that we're experiencing right now outside of our doors. And this species is one of the few sort of species that in this broader group of our winter birds that is showing fairly consistent declines. And these declines are also found on Christmas count data and a couple other data sources that people have been digging out in the breeding grounds, because it's really hard to survey this species in the breeding grounds. But they're like a third as common as they were when the Backyard Winter Bird Survey started. And that same pattern, whoops, is borne out. I guess I didn't have a graph of that. And so there's concern that this species may be affected by climate change effects on the Arctic in terms of all sorts of possibilities, like, you know, changing freeze-thaw cycles early in the spring, and that affects on insect supplies and any number of things, but no one's really studied them. So there's another master's or PhD project for somebody if they really want to deal with mosquitoes the size of Volkswagens. This little guy, anybody know what this one is? We'll take another quick quiz. Cute little round, it's like an angry bird, actually.
It's on mute.
House. There we go. Yeah, Nancy's always a quick one. Oh, yeah, Nancy and Bayard are the ones that always answer questions. This is the house sparrow, and this one is, of course, is not native to New Hampshire. This is a European species that was brought over because people in Europe like them. They're like friendly backyard sparrow, but in the North America, they are kind of a pest. In many cases, they will actually be aggressive to other native birds. Otherwise, when they're hanging out by your general Burger King or some strip mall, they're probably fine. And they've got a really bizarre population trend here, kind of this consistent decline for a while, then an up and then a down again. Overall, data for this species in North America suggests it's declining, which, since it's not native, is not a big deal. It's also declining back in Europe, and people are actually concerned about it there. And the fact that it's potentially declining in North America, despite being a very optimistic human adapted species, is a little bit of cause for concern of, okay, if our non-native pest species are declining, that is another red flag for kind of the state of our environment in some places. So appreciate house sparrows for being potentially one of our canaries in our global coal mine. But also, if they start using your birdhouses, just kick them out so something else can do it. Here's another fun story. This is the house finch, which is not native to Eastern North America. It's native to Western North America. And back in the 70s, there was a illegal shipment of house finches that was released on purpose, I believe at LaGuardia or JFK, one of those two big New York airports. They let them all go so they wouldn't get busted because they're protected species. And from that little nexus, house finches slowly expanded to concentric rings from New York City to basically cover the Eastern United States and join up with the Western population in the Rocky Mountains. So this species was unknown in North America, in New Hampshire, until the 70s, early 80s, and then expanded somewhat dramatically. We didn't start including them into the thing until the late 80s, so they're already here. But then something happened in the mid 90s, right here. We should have made this, I should have thought about this one, Mark. This would have been an excellent poll question. So I'm going to let it sit for a second here. Anybody know what happened to house finches in the mid 90s in New England? There'll be extra bonus points if you get it right.
You gotta say something.
They had conjunctivitis and they died.
Yeah, it was actually salmonella, but conjunctivitis is also implicated.
Eyes were sealed.
Yep.
Very sad.
Conjunctivitis is still out there. So yes, extra bonus points for Leonard and Meredith. We'll send those to you in some secret digital Bitcoin or something.
Yeah, we like chocolate.
When I give this talk at like garden clubs, there's always refreshments. I give people extra cookies, but unfortunately we don't have any of those. But yeah, there was a salmonella outbreak that really decimated, actually more than decimated, house finch populations. And the theory was because these guys were descended from a relatively small cohort of introduced birds, they were a little bit inbred. And as a result, they didn't have the natural range of immunity to the salmonella, and a lot of them died. And that, since they did say conjunctivitis is also an ongoing problem for this species. They get it regularly. I had a bird in my feeders just last week. His eyes getting kind of swollen shut and all crusty over. They can go blind. They eventually die. And again, they're probably just have a less resistance to some of the diseases as a result. And if you do see a bird with that, you should take your feeders in for a couple of weeks, clean them out, bleach them, get rid of all the disease, and let, then put stuff back out. And again, so yeah, so disease can have a big effect on bird populations, especially in the case of house finches when they might be inbred and things like that. I see Holly also got the conjunctivitis piece correct on the chat. And then of course, there's the close relative of house finch and our state bird, the purple finch. And there's a lot of potential confusion between these two species, and we're getting more and more, trying to be more and more careful on the backyard winter bird survey about people telling these two apart, because this guy is rare and getting rarer every year. So the blue line is the backyard winter bird survey. The pink line is the summer data. And you can see, especially in the summer data, that the species is it's less than half as abundant as it was 50 years ago. We're not sure why. It could be a climate change thing. Some people proposed competition with house finches, but they were declining before house finches were even here, over here in the 60s and early 70s. And you can see in the backyard winter bird survey, also a general decline with occasional peaks. Because like other finches, these guys can be eruptive, but they're becoming quite rare. And people in the southern half of the state report purple finches and no house finches. We're a little suspect because they're actually getting quite scarce. And this winter, there's almost none around anywhere, one or two here and there. So be very cautious when you're identifying your small red finches. So we may have to change our state bird if it goes extinct or something like that. That would be a bit of a bummer. Okay, more finches. Finches are great. I can talk about finches for hours. We have 2 species in this picture. Upper left is a pine siskin. Lower right is an American goldfinch. Close related. Goldfinches, of course, breed all over the place and also winter all over the place. You know, it might be different birds. The ones that breed here might go south. The ones that show up in the winter are from farther north. Whereas siskins are primarily a northern species, like the purple finch, that come down in the winter. And siskins are one of those classic eruptive species where you've got these huge peaks followed by total almost absence. And they're like the red-breasted nuthatches, responding to food crops in the north, usually spruce seeds or birch seeds, which again both cycle up in Canada. So if there's no birch seeds and no spruce seeds in Canada, siskins will go somewhere else. And this fall, they came to New Hampshire. And we had some pretty good siskin numbers, but then they kind of kept going. And right now there are still siskins around here and there, but they're much more patchily distributed. So, you know, they might be more into Pennsylvania or something for all we know at this point. And things like the Christmas count will pick that up, but we may not have as many as I thought we might have on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. I still expect more than usual, however, so we'll see what happens. I had a flock of 30 just 2 days ago. No, yesterday, half a mile from my house. So they're around, but I had one in the same place last week, so they're unpredictable. Goldfinches also go up and down, but there's always a bunch. You look at the numbers here, by the way. The average number of goldfinch per person is between 2 and like 8. The number of, okay, these are totally different scales, so that's not a very useful comparison. Whereas you can actually have, 8, several thousand, multiply this, I'm just doing quick math. So normally the number of goldfinches we have is around 8 to 10,000. So there's always more goldfinches than siskins. So forget what I was about to say. But goldfinches go up and down as well, again, because they're also responding to food supplies elsewhere, but there's always a fair number around. So even if you think about roughly 1,200 people do this survey every year, so there's roughly 4,000 or 5,000 goldfinches on the Backyard Winter Survey every year. Whereas, some years there's almost no siskins whatsoever. Another classic eruptive species, which so far isn't being very cooperative in 2021, is this guy. This is the common redpoll, which, as you may see from both these pictures, these birds love the Niger seed or thistle seed, we call it, the little tiny seeds. They were specialists on small seeds. So if you want to track them, get some Niger. But redpolls are another classic eruptive, and they have a very predictable pattern of every other year. There's a couple of cases here where the supposedly good year was not very good, like 2017 there, and a couple of years in the 80s. But basically every other year there's an increase and then it decreases. This year, so far, there's a lot of indication of a good increase, but the problem is this year, so far, they're not usually at feeders very much. I don't know if anybody's got some at feeders, probably not. And I think most of us are farther south, but they're out there. But there's still so many birch seeds out in the woods and fields that they're quite happy at those. But maybe in a month, by the time Backyard Winter Bird Survey rolls around, maybe more will be showing at feeders. So how big this peak is going to be in our data, won't know until after the data are collected. And I don't usually look at the data and analyze them until like October, November. So if you participate this year, you'll have to wait several months until around now to see what the results are. And you can get all excited and say, well, Pam was full of crap. I didn't get any redpolls. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Have her fired. But yes, we should see more redpolls this year than last year. And if not, then I guess I'll just eat this hat, which is, I don't know, it's an expensive hat. I'm not going to eat it. All right, here's another very famous bird. It's actually even on my sweater. And I suspect people on this call may remember the good old days when evening grosbeaks descended like proverbial flies and destroyed sunflower seed by the pound in a day back in the 90s and 80s. Another northern finch would show up in huge numbers back in the 80s and the early 90s, as the graph shows, and then just suddenly they went away. And people always ask, where did the evening grosbeaks go? How come I don't see evening grosbeaks anymore? And the answer is because evening grosbeaks went somewhere else. And evening grosbeaks, unlike the other finches that I've talked about so far, the eruptive finches, are mainly responding to a breeding season phenomenon, which is an insect called the spruce budworm, which is a moth that eats fir trees and spruce trees. And budworm is like a 30 to 40 year population cycle. And during big upswings in budworm, evening grosbeaks become super abundant. They actually can specialize on budworm like some other warblers do. And they'll take advantage of that. They'll be more successful. They have more baby grosbeaks. And conveniently enough, the last big budworm outbreak was in the 70s and 80s. And evening grosbeaks capitalized on that. They were all over the place. They moved south. They actually bred as far south as Connecticut because there were so many evening grosbeaks running around the Northeast. And then the budworm outbreak dissipated, and the grosbeaks kind of just became very local and sparse. And I believe even a few of those years we didn't have any. It's probably very close to zero. And then in the last 5 years or so, a new budworm outbreak is growing in Quebec. It has now entered New Brunswick. It'll probably be in Maine within a few years, maybe reach New Hampshire. And what we're starting to see, it's very, very subtle, but there's a couple more little peaks here. If you look at those 2012 to 2015 or so, almost none, but then up, down, up higher, down less low. And there's evening grosbeaks around this winter in scattered flocks. My friend and I were up north, and we had 60 at a friend's flock in Jefferson on Saturday. And I occasionally hear one down here in Concord. They're around, and will certainly be more common on the survey this year than they were last year. And again, they may be slowly increasing back up as that budworm outbreak grows and expands to the north of us. So they may be back for all of us who remember the good old days of swarms of grosbeaks. Somebody mentioned this bird during our little pre-talk. This is a pine grosbeak, a female. There's a male hiding in the lower and center left, kind of behind a bunch of stuff, the bright pink male. Another northern finch breeds across the boreal forest. Does not breed at all in New Hampshire. And these guys eat fruit. And mountain ash is their food crop to the north of us. And if that crop is poor, they come south and find crab apples and ornamental cherries and ornamental pears. And so if you haven't seen a pine grosbeak, go to your nearest strip mall with a bunch of ornamental fruit trees and watch, because they're probably nearby somewhere chowing down on those fruits. They're basically statewide right now in scattered flocks. They don't show up at feeders very often because they eat fruit, but they're often around, and they're very fun to watch. They're very, very tame. You can actually go right up to them and take their pictures and things like that. So their population does the same sort of stuff. Every other year, there's a bit of an increase in response to changing food supplies up north. And early indications, again, are that this year is going to be a relatively good year, especially considering the recent pattern, in the last 15 years or so. I don't have a slide for it, but there are two other finches I just want to toss out there. The two species of crossbills that are also all over the place right now, which are specialized. They've got these funky crossbills to extract seeds from pine cones, and red crossbills showed up in the state back in June, white-winged crossbills in November, and reds have since mostly left, but they're both around, and there's a chance that some people will be finding them on their backyard surveys. Because one of the things the backyard survey does is not just your feeders. If you hear a bird fly over your house, or you see a duck outside on the ocean outside your house, that counts. It's not just what's at your feeders, whatever you can see in your yard. So we might expect a few extra white-winged crossbills, especially showing up on the survey this year. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with those. So yeah, that's one of the big stories of the winter of 2021, is that there's basically what we call a mega flight of all the eruptive finches are around at the same time. It's like, it doesn't happen very often. So get out there and find them and enjoy them. A couple other fruit-eating birds, in addition to the pine grosbeak, are our waxwings. One of which, on the left, the cedar waxwing breeds here, and is highly nomadic. I haven't seen one for a couple of weeks now, but they're around, and they might come back. They explore everything all over the place. And the bird on the right, the slightly larger, more colorful, look at the white in the wings and the rusty underneath the tail. That's the Bohemian waxwing, which is another boreal species like the pine grosbeak that shows up every other year. And you can see their big peaks, that's multiplied by 5, so it's not the same scale. But again, every other year or so, Bohemians come south, and Bohemians are coming south this year as well. There was a report from Gorham a week ago of 500 of them. There's only been a couple of records south of the White Mountains so far, but they don't usually show up in southern New Hampshire until late January or February, so when they run out of food farther north. And the cedar waxwings just wander around, but they're obviously a little more consistent here, and they'll show up again when they feel like it. Another frugivore, a couple more fruit eaters. Forgetting about these guys. People are used to them now, but robins, until recently, were not a common winter bird in New Hampshire. They're the first sign of spring. Well, guess what? They don't leave anymore. Maybe in the north they leave, but south of the mountains, they're pretty much here all winter in big flocks looking for yummy fruit to eat. And you can see this started happening in the late 90s, early 2000s. Numbers started increasing. They kind of got stable. There was some big fluctuations, and now they kind of stabilized. Whether that's a real decline or not, I don't know. But it was a little weird because last year on the survey, robins were actually less common than bluebirds on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. So the number for robins there looks like number per observer about like 0.3. Bluebirds number per observer was actually almost 1. There were more bluebirds than robins last February on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. And bluebirds are just doing the same thing that red-bellied woodpeckers and cardinals and titmice did. They breed here, but now they're wintering here, increasing numbers, mostly south of the Lakes region, pretty rare up north. But increasing quite dramatically. Is that a climate change thing? Is it a food supply thing? Hard to say, but they're clearly here to stay in the winter. And it's very fun seeing a bright blue bird against the snow. It's one way of getting through the winter. And then there's a few larger species out there that also visit feeders. Of course, we all know what this guy is. This is our good friend, the wild turkey. You may not know that I can't remember when, but turkeys were extirpated from New Hampshire. They were hunted out of existence by the early 1900s. Between hunting and loss of habitat, they were gone. And it wasn't until the early 70s, I believe, that Fish and Game started trying to bring them back by bringing birds in from Pennsylvania and establishing a new population. And of course, you wouldn't know they were rare, but they're everywhere now. And like a lot of other species, you can see this on the graph. So 10 years before this data started being collected, there were no turkeys. So they were very, very rare then, but then they've slowly gotten good and they got established, and then boom, and now people report, tons and tons of turkeys, if they're lucky. Conservation success story. Sometimes bird feeders are secondary feeders. This particular bird here is a Cooper's hawk. It's a little blurry because I took it through my window. Looks like a focus on the trees anyway. And it was probably eating mourning dove. I can't remember what it was eating, but if you've got bird feeders, you obviously will attract birds that eat birds. And these are the two accipiter hawks that are quite common, sharp-shinned and Cooper's hawk. And it's a fun story. When I first moved to New Hampshire in 1989, Cooper's hawk was listed as a threatened species in New Hampshire. And I was, birding. I was up at Dartmouth and I see Cooper's hawks. Why is this thing listed? This shouldn't be listed. And that's simply because at that point it had been increasing and they hadn't changed it yet. But you can see here, this is Cooper's hawk. And back then, pretty uncommon, but they were increasing, and now they just recovered, ups and downs because there's not many of them. And there is some speculation that Cooper's hawks are benefited from, other measures that were taken to protect other birds of prey, like banning DDT. and so forth. And they were just, not as obvious as peregrine falcons and ospreys and bald eagles, but they were possibly impacted as well. And they also may have been adapting to more urban and suburban landscapes and saying, okay, I can handle this. There's lots of pigeons and chickadees to eat. I'm just going to hang out here. And so that species is obviously no longer listed as threatened in New Hampshire, and doing quite well. Another fun success story is our biggest woodpecker, our pterodactyl, or pileated woodpecker, which is a species of large intact forests, and probably declined a lot back in 100 years ago when we were mostly cleared for farmland and were giant fires in the White Mountains. But like the Cooper's hawk, it is adapted to human landscapes and is nicely, slowly and surely increasing. Last year was a record high. We averaged almost one. Oh no, that's times 10. So 0.1 pileated woodpecker per observer. Not everybody doesn't get one yet. It'll take a few more decades to get there. But this species, another sort of species in a similar position as raven, that's also slowly increasing in the state as a result of adapting to human landscapes. So there's lots of cool stories here between species adapting to our landscapes, species responding to food supplies, species responding to climate change, for good or bad. And then as always, there's a few random surprises in the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. And this was one of them one year. Anybody know what that is?
I guess that.
This is my, yep. Which kind?
Western.
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 No, this is actually a regular Baltimore Oriole. But yeah, this Oriole showed up at a woman's feeder in Concord 10 years ago or so. She called Audubon, there's an Oriole at my feeder. We go, what? And so since she lived about 2 miles from Audubon, I went over and checked it out, and here it was, it's a female Baltimore Oriole, and it spent a couple of weeks hanging out at her feeder. And every year there's some random bird like this that shows up that's not supposed to be here. In the case of this Oriole, it's a species that should be in Costa Rica right now, and it just didn't leave because it's got something messed up with its navigation system. Last year we had a Bullock's Oriole, which is the Western Oriole, counterpart to the Baltimore Oriole, that was at a feeder in Stratham, and a Baltimore Oriole at a feeder in Hampton. So we had both kinds of Orioles last year in the winter in New Hampshire. And birds, I always like to say, are the planet's best dispersers. They can fly long distances, they can show up almost anywhere. And last year we had a painted bunting at a bird feeder in Conway. Female painted bunting. So it's like random stuff shows up, and that's what kind of is fun about the Backyard Winter Bird Survey, is that people find things that you're not supposed to find. Or wood thrush. There was a wood thrush last year as well, which is supposed to be in Mexico. So if you watch your feeders, you will find fun things. And there's no clear pattern to Baltimore Orioles. We can't tell stories about them. We can just tell stories about this. But some of the species that do winter not too far south of us are increasing slowly but surely as winter birds, probably as a result of climate change. Things that normally migrate to New Jersey or Maryland that are becoming increasingly common in New England. So on that, there's a little birds that have 3 different species here. And I'll just put this up here for people to look at and copy or do a screenshot or whatever you want to do, because there's 2 other programs out there run by Cornell that also involve bird count stuff during the winter that you're encouraged to help with, as well as obviously helping with ours. And at that point, we can open it up to all sorts of questions or other jokes you might have, or heckling, or just watch out because there are swords on the wall. If I can find where you live, I'll come after you. All right. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Pam. That was a lot of information.
Yeah, that's what I am. I'm a font of wisdom.
It's cool to see how the story can progress out with so much data, and to know that data comes from folks like the ones that are on the call.
Yeah, community scientists. citizen scientists, they're shifting that phrase now to be a little more inclusive.
Pam, did you see anything very unusual in the Christmas bird count that might give us a clue what we might be looking for? I know there was a lot of crossbills, and I think there's quite a few red-breasted nuthatches on our route.
Yeah. So those, like I was saying before, the finches and red-breasted nuthatches are going to be the expected stars of the show in terms of more common than usual in a month, hopefully, than they are most winters.
I have a question about bird houses, and to what extent do winter birds use bird houses in the winter?
It's a fun question. Bluebirds and wrens will often roost in them. Yeah, I was doing a Christmas bird count and stopped at a birdhouse that was just happened to be along the road, and I stopped and it freaked out. Like 6 bluebirds came out of it. So they will roost in those things to stay warm at night. But most birds are probably not doing that. Like chickadees are probably just hunkering down, and they might be doing a little bit of it too, chickadees, but only things that use cavities like chickadees, nuthatches, bluebirds, wrens.
Pam,
Mhm.
you didn't mention starling,
No, I didn't. You want me to?
and I have starlings at my feeders. Are they a winter bird?
Yep.
Or are
Starlings.
they, they're just,
Yeah, I could put I just didn't put a picture of starlings in. Starling populations are like house sparrows. They're kind of slowly decreasing. And yeah, they've obviously come to feeders like everybody else does. Another non-native species.
and push everybody else out?
Yeah. Until the grosbeaks appear and then they win.
Pam, I got a question for you in the chat.
Yeah, I see
from
that, from
Jennifer,
David.
let's start with that one. If purple finch becomes extinct, what would you recommend become the new state bird?
Well, it's not going to become extinct, hopefully within our lifetimes. I don't know. No one's ever asked me that. We should take a poll. Bicknell's thrush, they'll be extinct too, unfortunately. I don't know. Anybody got an idea? Turkey. Bald eagle. So David asked about pileated woodpeckers, didn't track with the other woodpeckers. Well, they're all increasing. How well they track, I don't know. I should look at that. But they obviously do eat different food. Pileateds eat almost entirely carpenter ants and a few other boring beetles, whereas the other guys are a little more generalists. So who knows if that has anything to do with it? But I think the pileated increase has a lot to do with adaptation to smaller forest tracts.
Pam, I was
Yes.
going to say, I heard that Quebec did not spray for spruce budworm this summer because of COVID. So that may be promising for evening grosbeaks.
Yeah. There's an interesting. I actually did my master's thesis on spruce budworm in the West, and so I track spruce budworm stuff fairly closely because, as I think Jim at least knows, I really love my spruce budworm warblers as well as evening grosbeaks, and there's a lot of variation in how the Canadian provinces are dealing with the outbreak right now in terms of spraying and not spraying. And even if they spray, they still can't cover everything. And the things, once an outbreak gets going, it will just spread like a wildfire. And, it'll still be beneficial even if they manage to spray parts of it. They probably selectively spraying higher value timber and things like that.
Probably, yeah.
But yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the next 5-10 years. Buy sunflower seed stocks.
Pam, I have another question in the chat that I think just came to me, but are the charts easily available to the public or accessible in any way?
Not really, because they're all on my computer. They do, a lot of them show up in our annual report. from the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. We pick a couple of species to highlight. Those of you who participate. By the way, who participates in this? We should ask everybody. Wasn't that a poll question we had? So yeah, you know, we could, but it's like, you know, they're just an Excel file. It's not like there's a document or something. Yeah, here's a good question. Let's see how many people will help with this. And if we can't tell who says no, so we'll track you down somehow. We get a list of registrants, right, Mark? We can just see who doesn't
I don't know how to track it that well.
No, but you've got the list of participants, and Becky's got the list of participants and the things. We just do a cross check. Oh, look at this. We got a good turnout. Oh, Backyard Winter Bird Survey for those people that don't know what BWBS is. That's what the whole data set here is.
That was
20
my
years. Well
funny
done.
way. That was my funny way of saying no, I don't participate.
Oh, okay, I get you. Well, that's not clear to us.
It's 10 years.
So that's no, by the way. The fourth answer is no.
Fourth answer is I do not participate.
20 years. That's a good one.
Wow.
Did you say 10 years?
Nobody's done it for the 10. It's either few or 20. And where people are just stopping answering. Who's the person that's been doing it for 20? Congratulations.
Holly, nice.
Hmm.
And here are
Even
those
I haven't done
results.
I haven't done it that long, I don't think. I've been working for Audubon for 20 years. I'd have to check. I don't think I can check.
So the 9 of you that don't know what the Backyard Winter Bird Survey is, I'm going to put it back in the chat, and you're more than welcome to join us in looking at the birds.
Oh, no, Great Backyard Bird Count is different, Nancy. You can do them both, though. Any other questions? Lost my cursor. Where's my cursor gone? There it is. Ah, there it is.
I have a comment, which is you said the cardinals weren't that far north yet, but we did see one in Errol in recent weeks. So
Yeah,
they are showing up.
they're just not as common. They're, you know, titmice are also an Earl. Uh-oh.
Pam,
Yes.
I have a question about mourning doves.
Okay.
Do
It's weird. My
mourning-
screen is totally frozen too, but I can hear people still.
Oh, okay. Do mourning doves mate for life?
Probably because they don't live very long.
So, and then, so I have a question because something got one of our mourning doves, I think, and we have a bunch of mourning doves, but we have a solo mourning dove. Do you think that, so is it possible that its mate was killed and it sort of isolated itself? It's not sort of hanging out with the group?
I don't know if Pam's just thinking really hard or she froze.
I think we lost her. Someone else can answer that?
I know I can't answer that.
She may have gone out looking for the mate. I don't know.
Well, while we wait for Pam to rejoin, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you all again for your interest in this speaker series. I'll be sending out a link to an evaluation survey, and actually, I think I can put that in the chat. This is like our 4th time doing a talk like this, and so we're really interested in hearing your feedback because we do intend to continue leading these types of talks for you all in the coming months. And I think the next one is actually going to be, we're going to have Pam back on to continue actually talking about the state of the birds and actually expand it beyond just winter birds and talk about the state of the birds as a whole, including, you know, which ones are thriving, which ones are in decline, and what people can do to help birds.
Thank you, Mark, and give thanks to Pam. We seem to have lost her, but
Oh, here she comes. She's in the waiting room. Just saw her. Of course. Hey, Pam. Oh, connecting the audio.
I'm back. Yay, sorry about that. I don't know what the hell was going on. Everything totally froze up on my entire computer. It wasn't even the internet thing.
Hmm.
So what was Anne asking? Is she even still there? Yes.
I'm still here.
Something about mourning doves, and then I disappeared.
And I think you muted yourself.
Thank you, Patty.
No, now it says mute.
Now
Now you're
so
talking.
it's the opposite. Okay.
Don't you just love this technology?
No, I do, but no. So Pam, if so my question is about mourning doves, and do they mate for life? And then we have a lot of mourning doves, but one of our mourning doves was killed by a hawk or a cat, something. And I just wondered, because we've had a mourning dove that sort of hangs out by itself, not with the group. And I wondered, do mourning doves, after they lose a mate, do they start to, I don't know, just isolate themselves?
Very doubtful. We have a tendency to anthropomorphize birds a lot.
You have what?
We have a tendency to anthropomorphize
Okay.
birds a lot.
Yeah.
Very few birds mate for life, and the ones that do are ones that require a lot of parental care. So swans, cranes, things like that, live a long time and have to train their kids how to migrate and stuff like that. Mourning doves, which probably honestly don't live more than 2 years. Most of these smaller birds don't live very long. For whatever reason, that bird is by itself, and it has nothing to do with mourning or any other weird kind of things that we might try to impinge upon it.
Thank you.
Yep.
And Pam, there was another question in the chat. Are there other diseases that are spread through bird feeders?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it was mostly conjunctivitis, and I can't even remember if salmonella was spread through bird feeders. It might have been. So yeah, the ones that I'm aware of. There's a possibility of possibly some other things that are probably not diseases per se, but some things like molds and stuff that might not be very healthy if you don't clean the things out with some regularity. But I think conjunctivitis right now is the big one.
Any other questions out there for Pam now that we've got her back?
I'm curious if there are
Diane just commented that salmonella is spread at feeders. Thanks, Diane.
if there are any fluctuations in the owl populations or
owls. That's a fun question, actually. We don't have very good data on owls for some obvious reasons, because they're out at night and we're not out surveying at night. But what we do see, the data we have, this is a little plug for maybe a talk that'll be coming up. Maybe I'm stealing Mark's thunder a little bit here.
No, I already mentioned it.
Oh, when I was offline?
Yeah.
So, I've done this big report on the state of the birds, and owls are tricky because we don't have good data on owls. The data we do have suggests that they're doing fine. The fun thing we notice with owls in the winter is that barred owls, which is probably our commonest owl, what we see, the who cooks for you owl, will respond, sort of short-term space and time to both food supply in terms of rodents and weather in terms of snow cover. So if there's lots of snow, it's harder for them to hunt, so they come to edges, or they come to feeders where everybody's leftover seed is attracting mice that you don't even know are there because underneath the snow, and then the owls will come and snarf those. And during particularly snowy winters, or like after big icy things when it's hard to hunt, you'll see more barred owls at edges and getting hit by cars and other unfortunate things. And we do occasionally see big spikes in barred owls, and a big spike in the backyard of bird survey means like 15 across 1,200 people. But so yeah, that doesn't track them very well. But you can infer when is it, you know, because we know what the weather's like, we can say, oh yeah, that's probably because of that big ice storm we had February 10th. So if we have a ton of snow or ice in the week before the backwinter survey, maybe it'll be more owls, but otherwise it's pretty much random noise.
Can I comment on that? Owls?
You certainly may, Robert.
You know, just driving down the highway, I've seen a number of owls that were dead on the side of the highway. So I think they're doing well because I'm seeing dead ones. But it's sad because, you know, cars are just speeding around and the owls have no chance. But now on these side roads, meaning side roads or back roads in Concord, you know, I've seen the dead owl now. So they're becoming more common that I'm seeing them dead.
Yeah.
So could that be an increase that the population's doing well?
Yeah, it could be a couple of things. I've also seen a couple of dead ones recently on I-93 north of here. And what also can happen with some of these larger birds that are much more obvious like that on roadkills is that if they had a good breeding season, there'll be more young owls around and they're going to be wandering around trying to find a new place, a new territory, because they get kicked out by their parents.
Yeah.
And so they're going to be, there's a possibility that our increase in roadkill that we're seeing, both you and I and maybe others, is because there was a really good year for young owls and they're all wandering around trying to find food. And obviously they don't know about roads and so they get hit. So that could indicate a good breeding season as well. Drive
I
slowly.
guess so the one who does the owl talk, the Martins from Massachusetts there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I imagine they would have some data on that, or is it
Yeah, I don't know.
just the fact that they do programs on owls as opposed to, you know, like how well they're doing or how
Right.
not so. Well, then you got to consider the other fellow who does the banding on the snowy owls down in Boston. There's another way to find out about owls. Finding out about the banding programs that they do on studies.
Yep. Yeah, so we know snowy owls are eruptive like these northern finches. They come south in response to either no food up north or high productivity up north in the Arctic tundra. And, you know, so they're migratory. So you can tie things together a little easier and they're actually visible during the day. So it's a lot easier to get data on things like snowy owls than it is on barred owls or great horned owls this year. I think Leonard and Meredith have a question. You're muted. The catchphrase of 2020, right? You're on mute.
Do you know whether they have put into effect the idea of culling barred owls in the West in defense of the spotted owl?
Yeah, I don't know
about that. I mean, I can understand why they want to do it. It sounds awful, but
it does.
But if they really are interfering with the dwindling supply of spotted owls because they're moving in and taking over the territory, then perhaps we should cull them. It's a hard call for people.
It is definitely a hard call.
But I wondered if you knew whether they were going to really do that or.
Yeah, I have not. I got enough to keep track of in New Hampshire. I do know that they were talking about that. I don't know whether I know it was being challenged probably in court. But for people who don't know, the spotted owl, which is a endangered species up in the Pacific Northwest, it depends on old growth forest. And as they've been cutting forest, barred owls from farther north and east have been slowly increasing in the Pacific Northwest and moving into the spotted owl habitat. And sometimes actually displacing them or killing them. And so they're a little concerned about that, obviously, and has been proposed. And one of the proposals has been to try to get rid of a few barred owls. I think that's like a last ditch effort because, it's like, okay, yeah, let's, they'll keep coming because they're being very successful. Successful species are often difficult to deal with. So I have no idea what's going on with that at the moment.
Thanks.
Yep.
How does the Cornell bird count and the other bird count that you mentioned, feeder watch. How is that in the sense of the dates?
Project Feeder Watch is something that you do every other week. So it's a long-term,
Oh,
over the course of a season thing,
okay.
which is actually provides much different data, like more consistent data. They actually do some other fun things on Project Feeder Watch, like have people track what they're eating, and now and then you can do other things. And then the Great Backyard Bird Count is another like 4-day thing. It's very similar to the Backyard Bird Survey. Sometimes it's the same weekend, sometimes it's a different weekend. But those
Thank
are
you.
both things. Yeah, they go. Nancy just said November to April is the Great Backyard Project Feeder Watch. Nancy clearly is on top of all this stuff. Good job. Well, there she is.
I've taken part in Project Feeder Watch for about 30 years now.
Wonderful.
Wow. That's
You are
pretty cool.
you are outstanding. So where's your data go?
Who's ours?
No, the Project Feeder Watch
That's Cornell.
It goes to Cornell.
of Cornell.
Yeah.
And you're here in New Hampshire?
Yes, I live in Hinsdale.
Oh, there's a sage thrasher near you.
Wow.
Speaking of weird birds in the wrong place,
Yeah, sage that, right?
bird that's supposed to be in the deserts of Arizona and northern Mexico right now is hanging out in Hinsdale.
It's in Hinsdale?
Yeah, there's one by the railroad tracks down by the river,
Oh, okay.
just south of the Ebenezer Hinsdale homestead there.
Oh, I know where that is. Okay.
Figured if you know it is, it's not a very big town.
No, I live in the northern part up near Wantastica.
Oh, yeah. So it's only a couple miles away from you. If you
Yeah.
feel like hanging out with 100 of your closest birder friends looking for a streaky brown bird, I'll be there on Sunday or Monday. Cool. Anything else? You guys have been great. Some good questions, some good discussion. Get out there and enjoy your birds.
Thank you. You're awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate it.
See y'all. Nice seeing some
Thank you,
familiar
Ken.
faces too.
Thanks so
Yeah.
much. Hope to see you at the next one.
Good job. Thank you very much, guys.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks. Happy birding.
Happy birding.